The most devastating casualty of the Vietnam War was not a city, a bridge, or an army, but the collective psyche of the world's undisputed superpower. In the spring of 1975, as the last American helicopters fled the rooftop of the Saigon embassy, a silent, invisible contagion was already settling deep into the American soul. This was not a biological pathogen, but a profound psychological paralysis that would freeze American foreign policy in its tracks for nearly 2 decades. This was the Vietnam Syndrome, a term coined not by medical doctors, but by politicians and military strategists, to describe a nation suddenly terrified of its own shadow. Why did a military defeat thousands of miles away strip an empire of its self-confidence, leaving its leaders paralyzed and its citizens deeply suspicious of any foreign involvement? To understand this collective trauma, we must look past the troop movements and treaty signings and peer into the shattered minds of the men who came home, only to find themselves treated as ghosts in their own land. The wound was not just physical, it was a fundamental fracture in the American myth of invincibility. For generations, Americans believed they were the undisputed forces of good, destined to win every conflict. Vietnam shattered that illusion, replacing it with a haunting question: what if we are not the heroes of the story? This realization created a deep, festering anger. Veterans returned to a country that wanted to forget they ever existed, while politicians desperately tried to diagnose what had gone wrong with the American war machine. Veterans who stepped off planes at Travis Air Force Base were met not with marching bands, but with protesters, indifference, or a cold, suffocating silence. They quickly learned to discard their uniforms in airport restrooms, desperate to blend back into a society that viewed them either as perpetrators of an unjust war or as reminders of a humiliating defeat. This domestic hostility exacerbated the psychological trauma of combat, creating a unique double bind of trauma: the horror of the jungle, followed by the betrayal of the homeland. The term itself became a battleground. For some, it was a shameful disease of cowardice that needed to be cured. For others, it was a vital, hard-won wisdom that protected the nation from its own worst impulses. In this exploration, we will trace the journey of this psychological scar, from the psychiatric wards where PTSD was first defined, to the halls of Congress where presidential power was stripped away, and finally to the deserts of Kuwait, where a president declared the syndrome dead. We will examine how a war that ended in the jungles of Southeast Asia continued to be fought in the hearts and minds of Americans for decades, shaping the world we live in today. To understand how this psychological paralysis took hold, we must look at the sheer scale of the human wreckage that returned from Southeast Asia. Between 1964 and 1973, nearly 3 million American servicemen and women deployed to Vietnam. They did not return to the triumphant parades of World War II, but to a silent, deeply polarized nation. By the mid-1970s, psychiatrists began noticing a disturbing pattern among returning soldiers. They suffered from vivid nightmares, uncontrollable rage, sudden panic attacks, and a profound inability to reintegrate into civilian life. At the time, the medical establishment had no official name for this condition. It was dismissed as combat fatigue or operational exhaustion, but this was different. It was a moral injury, a deep-seated conflict between the soldiers' actions in the jungle and their ethical framework back home. In 1980, after years of intense lobbying by veterans and sympathetic clinicians, the American Psychiatric Association finally recognized this condition in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, naming it Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, or PTSD. This medical recognition was a watershed moment, proving that the trauma of Vietnam was not a personal weakness, but a systemic injury. Yet, as the domestic psychological crisis deepened, a parallel trauma was infecting the halls of Washington. The military defeat had created a profound crisis of confidence in American institutions. The presidency, the military brass, and the intelligence agencies were no longer trusted. The public felt deeply deceived by the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the secret bombings of Cambodia, and the daily body counts broadcast on evening television. The nation had lost, not just a war, but its moral compass, leading to a pervasive skepticism that would define American culture for a generation. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, had already revealed that successive administrations had systematically lied to the public about the progress of the war. This institutional betrayal created a deep cynicism, a feeling that the government was willing to sacrifice its young men for a lie. The psychological wound of Vietnam was therefore twofold: a medical crisis of trauma among its soldiers, and a political crisis of legitimacy among its citizens. This cynicism was further fueled by the economic stagnation of the 1970s, which many attributed to the massive, unchecked spending on the war. The proud, self-assured America of the post-World War II era had vanished, replaced by a nation doubting its economic strength, its political system, and its moral authority on the global stage. This crisis of confidence was not merely an abstract debate, it directly influenced the everyday lives of citizens, who began to view government declarations with a default setting of disbelief, forever changing the relationship between the state and the public. As the late 1970s progressed, this domestic trauma solidified into a rigid foreign policy doctrine. The term Vietnam Syndrome was popularized by conservative politicians, most notably Ronald Reagan during his 1980 presidential campaign, who lamented that the nation was suffering from a failure of will. To Reagan and his allies, the syndrome was a debilitating sickness that prevented America from standing up to Soviet expansionism during the height of the Cold War. However, for a war-weary public and a cautious Congress, it was a necessary shield against future quagmires. Congress acted swiftly to curb presidential war-making powers, passing the War Powers Resolution of 1973 over President Richard Nixon's veto. This law required the president to consult Congress before committing troops abroad, a direct reaction to the unchecked escalation of the Vietnam War. Suddenly, the Imperial presidency was shackled. Every time a global crisis arose, the ghost of Vietnam loomed large. When Marxist movements gained ground in Central America, particularly in El Salvador and Nicaragua, the American public reacted with immediate alarm. The collective memory of the draft, the high casualty rates, and the televised horrors of jungle warfare made the public highly sensitive to any military escalation. Journalists and politicians constantly warned of another Vietnam, a phrase that became a powerful rhetorical weapon. The military itself was deeply divided. High-ranking officers who had served as junior commanders in Vietnam were determined never again to fight a war without clear political objectives, overwhelming force, and public support. This internal military philosophy eventually crystallized into the Weinberger Doctrine, formulated by Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger in 1984. It set incredibly high thresholds for the commitment of U.S. forces abroad, requiring that any intervention must be vital to national interests, fought with the clear intention of winning, and backed by the American people and Congress. The superpower was now operating with a self-imposed handbrake, terrified that any minor intervention would drag it into another endless, unwinnable conflict. This caution was not merely theoretical. In 1983, when a truck bomb destroyed the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 American servicemen, President Reagan chose to withdraw U.S. forces rather than escalate the conflict. This decision, highly uncharacteristic of Reagan's aggressive rhetoric, demonstrated the sheer power of the Vietnam Syndrome. Even the most hawkish president of the era recognized that the American public had zero appetite for a protracted, ambiguous peacekeeping mission in the Middle East. The memory of the dead in Vietnam made the loss of life in Beirut politically unsupportable, forcing a tactical retreat that would have been unthinkable in the pre-Vietnam era. The ultimate test of this psychological paralysis came in the hot sands of the Persian Gulf in 1990, when Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. President George H.W. Bush saw an opportunity to redefine America's global role in the post-Cold War era, but the ghost of Vietnam was not easily exorcised. As Bush mobilized a massive international coalition, the American public and Congress debated the intervention with intense anxiety. Protesters marched in Washington, carrying signs that read, "No more Vietnams." Senators warned of tens of thousands of body bags returning from the desert, predicting a bloody, prolonged ground war against Iraq's battle-hardened army. The fear was palpable, a collective panic that the United States was walking into another trap. Bush knew that to win the war, he first had to defeat the syndrome at home. He meticulously gathered congressional approval, built a broad international coalition that included Arab nations, and promised the public that this would not be another protracted conflict. He unleashed a military strategy designed specifically to counter every mistake of the Vietnam War: overwhelming air power, a clear and limited objective to liberate Kuwait, and a rapid, decisive ground campaign. When the ground war began in February 1991, it lasted a mere 100 hours. The Iraqi forces were decisively routed, with minimal American casualties. The nation erupted in celebration, a collective release of 20 years of pent-up anxiety and shame. On the 1st of March, 1991, a triumphant President Bush declared to a group of state legislators, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." It was a moment of immense national catharsis, a belief that the psychological shadow had finally been lifted, and that America could once again project its power globally without fear of self-destruction. The yellow ribbons that decorated trees across the nation symbolized a public that was finally ready to embrace its military and celebrate victory. This victory was broadcast live on 24-hour cable news, presenting a clean, high-tech war of precision-guided munitions and bloodless victories, a stark contrast to the gritty, televised horrors of the Mekong Delta. The military had successfully managed the media, ensuring that the public saw a highly sanitized version of combat, further erasing the painful memories of the past. The strategic use of pool reporting and controlled press briefings kept the grim realities of the battlefield far from American living rooms, preventing the domestic backlash that had doomed the previous war effort. But did the Gulf War truly cure the Vietnam syndrome, or did it merely mask the underlying symptoms? In the immediate aftermath of the victory, the United States entered a period of unprecedented geopolitical dominance, often called the unipolar moment. Yet, the caution instilled by Vietnam did not vanish overnight. It merely adapted. Throughout the 1990s, American foreign policy remained deeply hesitant to intervene in humanitarian crises where no vital national interests were at stake. The ghost of Vietnam reappeared in 1993 during the disastrous intervention in Somalia, where the downing of 2 Black Hawk helicopters and the televised desecration of American soldiers' bodies led to an immediate withdrawal. This event, dubbed the Somalia Syndrome, was a direct descendant of the Vietnam trauma, proving that the American public still had an incredibly low tolerance for casualties in ambiguous conflicts. This lingering hesitation had tragic consequences, most notably during the 1994 Rwandan genocide, where the United States and the international community stood by, paralyzed by the fear of another foreign quagmire. Even during the NATO interventions in the Balkans in the late 1990s, the Clinton administration relied almost exclusively on high-altitude airstrikes, desperate to avoid risking American boots on the ground. The quick victory in the Gulf had created an illusion of easy war, but the fundamental fear of prolonged, irregular warfare remained deeply embedded in the American military psyche. The syndrome was not dead. It was simply waiting for the next long, asymmetric conflict to reassert its grip on the nation. The military's reliance on technology and air power was a direct coping mechanism, designed to avoid the messy, human cost of ground combat that had traumatized the nation in the 1960s and 1970s. This period of the 1990s showed that while the outward confidence of the American military had been restored, its operational planning was still haunted by the fear of mission creep. Every deployment was scrutinized for an exit strategy, a term that became a staple of military planning, directly derived from the lack of a clear exit in Vietnam. The fear of getting bogged down in an endless occupation governed every geopolitical calculation, proving that the lessons of Southeast Asia were still quietly dictating the limits of American power. The true legacy of the Vietnam syndrome lies in its profound transformation of how nations perceive the limits of military power. It taught a painful but essential lesson. that technological superiority and overwhelming firepower cannot guarantee victory against a determined adversary fighting on their home turf. The syndrome was not a disease of cowardice, as some politicians claimed, but a healthy democratic immune response to the hubris of empire. It forced a superpower to confront the moral and practical limits of its global ambitions. When those lessons were forgotten, as they were in the years following the September 11 attacks, the consequences were devastating. The invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan mirrored the tragic patterns of Vietnam: ambiguous goals, a failure to understand local culture, a reliance on puppet governments, and a protracted counterinsurgency war that eroded public support over decades. The forever wars of the 21st century proved that the Vietnam syndrome was not a temporary psychological aberration, but a permanent warning sign. Today, as geopolitical tensions rise and the world enters a new era of great power competition, the memory of Vietnam remains a vital touchstone. It reminds leaders that the truest measure of a nation's strength is not its capacity to wage war, but its wisdom to avoid conflicts that cannot be won, and its responsibility to care for the human beings who bear the scars of those decisions. The psychological wounds of Vietnam ultimately redefined the contract between the American government and its citizens, establishing that the blood of its youth should never again be spent without clear purpose and honest justification. Furthermore, the syndrome reshaped the concept of patriotism. Before Vietnam, patriotism was often equated with unquestioning support for government policy. After Vietnam, a new form of patriotism emerged, one that questioned authority, demanded transparency, and insisted that holding leaders accountable was the highest civic duty. This shift fundamentally altered the American political landscape, creating a permanent class of anti-war activists, investigative journalists, and skeptical citizens who view military interventions with deep suspicion. The lesson of Vietnam is that military force is a blunt instrument, incapable of solving complex political, social, and cultural problems in foreign lands. It is a lesson that must be relearned by every generation of policymakers who believe they can reshape the world in their own image. The scars of the Vietnam War are still visible today, not just in the black granite of the memorial in Washington or the quiet villages of Vietnam, but in the very way we think about war and peace. The Vietnam syndrome was a turning point that redefined an entire generation's relationship with its government and its military. It showed us that the psychological wounds of war last far longer than the physical battles, shaping foreign policy and societal trust for decades. As we look at the complex global conflicts of the 21st century, we must ask ourselves, have we truly learned the lessons of Vietnam, or are we destined to repeat them? We want to hear your thoughts on this critical chapter of history. How do you think the legacy of the Vietnam War continues to influence global events today? Do you see echoes of the Vietnam syndrome in modern foreign policy decisions? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this exploration of history and psychology valuable, please hit the like button and share this video with others who want to understand the deeper forces shaping our world. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the stories that built our modern world. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of our community of curious minds. Your engagement helps us keep producing high-quality, deeply researched historical content. To understand the present, we must courageously examine the wounds of our past, and by sharing these stories, we keep the lessons of history alive. Let us remember that history is not just a collection of dates and battles, but a continuous human story of struggle, healing, and the search for truth. By looking closely at the Vietnam syndrome, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complex human cost of global politics. We hope this video has sparked a meaningful conversation in your mind, and we look forward to reading your insightful comments. Stay curious, stay questioning, and we will see you in the next video.